This is Richard Wolff from Democracy at Work, responding to another Ask Prof. Wolff question from our Patreon community. This one comes from Mikkel, and Mikkel asks about the stock market. The basic question is what happens to the stock market if we really have a social change, if we get beyond capitalism? Is it going to be, for example, that the stock market is sort of disbanded, dissolved? Is it taken over by the government, maybe by force? Uh, what happens to it? What's the place of a stock market? And I like this question because it opens up an opportunity for me to remind folks of how malleable, how variable institutions are. Stock markets have existed on and off for a long period of human history. I want to remind you, however, that for even more of human history, there was no such thing as a stock market. And in those periods of time, people lived their lives, produced, distributed goods and services, grew very wealthy, and so on. Having a stock market one way or the other isn't the be all and end all of anything. Not only that, stock markets vary all over the place. Let me give you a few examples just to drive the point home. You can buy a share of stock in a company, and so when you do, there are some companies that will give you the right to vote on who becomes a member of the board of directors if you have shares of stock. In fact, typically, you get as many votes as you have shares. So whether or not Mary or John becomes a member of the board of directors of a corporation depends on whether they get enough votes. Whether they get the majority of votes, then they get elected. If someone else gets the majority of votes, the other person gets elected. And how many votes does a shareholder get? As many as they own shares. But you can also buy a share of stock in the stock market in a company which does not give you that right, which gives you no rights like that at all. You know how many votes you get if you buy that share of stock? How many votes on electing board of directors? Zero. Is that possible? Yes. Is that legal? Yes. That's the way stock markets are allowed to work, for example, here in the United States. Some stock market uh, allow companies to pay no dividends at all. In other words, you buy a share of stock and you don't get any share of the profits of that company at all. In other companies, they distribute portions of their profit to their shareholders as what we call dividends. Is a stock required to pay a dividend? In some systems, yes. In the one we have in this country, no. Many companies in the stock market pay no dividends to their shareholders at all. In other words, stock markets vary. They always have varied. There is no necessity to have them, or if you do have them, that they work in this way or that they work in another. But now let me get to what may be another question lying here for us to deal with. We know we have stock markets today. We know also that millions, billions, trillions of dollars have been invested in stock markets, and that capitalism is a system that makes it very attractive and quite typical for wealthy people to accumulate shares and hold them in stock markets. So, what happens if you go beyond capitalism? What happens to the stock market? Well, the answer is the same as has happened again in history, which is why history is such a good teacher. What did other systems do when it came time to change to a new and different system? What happened to the wealth accumulated in the old system? Well, let me give you a couple of examples. In the Civil War here in the United States between the North and the South, an enormous part of the wealth of the South was invested in slaves. Thousands and thousands of masters owned slaves. They had spent huge amounts of their money to buy and hold slaves. When Abraham Lincoln, as president, signed the Emancipation Proclamation, he said in that proclamation, slavery is outlawed. If you're a slave, you're not a slave anymore. And if you're the master, you don't own anybody anymore. There was no compensation. The slave owners lost their wealth. It was taken away as part of a transition to a new society, a capitalist one, in which slavery was not allowed. You could do exactly the same thing with the wealth invested in shares of stock. As of tomorrow morning, that's not a stock anymore. That's just a funny piece of paper that you have stored away in a safe deposit box. You can tear it into strips and use it in the bathroom for other purposes, but it isn't a shareholder stock piece of paper the way it once was. Let me give you another example in another case. When feudalism was ended in Russia in the 19th century, here's what happened. The lords of the land, the feudal lords who had owned the land of Russia, were told, as of the revolution now, when we're ending feudalism in Russia, you don't own the land anymore. You're losing it. You're not the owner. Just like the masters were no longer the owners of the slaves. But we're going to do something nice for you. We're going to give you a government bond. We're going to give you a certain amount of bonds for whatever amount of land you have. And the government will promise to pay you an interest every year on these government bonds, which we're giving you as a kind of partial compensation for the land you lost. If the transition to a socialist future were to end the stock market, what it could do is give bonds to the shareholders in partial compensation for having lost the wealth of the old form of the society. But we shouldn't hold back any kind of worry. Societies have gone through changes like this periodically in the history of the human race, and wealth accumulated in various forms had to give way, sometimes with compensation and sometimes without. But social change is a very profound force and isn't held back by the particular forms that wealth has taken. If explanations like these strike you as valuable, as ways of thinking further in the direction you want to go, then partner with us. Share these videos with others. Consider going to our YouTube channels where you can see presentations like these, clips based on this, lectures. It doesn't cost anything to subscribe, and it's another way of partnering and extending our reach. And of course, as always, if you can help defray some of the financial costs of the work we do, going to our website will enable you to do that as well. Thank you.